All right, so this is section 4 of chapter 7, in which we will cover the topics of control conditions and manipulation checks. So recall when we talked about the 4 ingredients of a true experiment, one of those ingredients was comparison. You have to compare some condition against some other condition. And in some cases, you are comparing one treatment condition against another treatment condition. So for example, maybe you have one type of therapy and you want to compare its effects against a different kind of therapy. Or in other situations, maybe you only want to evaluate a single therapy by itself. Now here, you still have to compare it to something. But in this case, you will compare it to a no treatment condition. So the treatment condition with the therapy you are evaluating would be called the experimental condition, and the no treatment condition would be called the control condition, whose purpose is to provide some baseline against which your comparison can be made. So there are different types of control conditions. One that we just alluded to is a no treatment condition. So imagine you are testing a drug for treating some disorder. The experimental group gets the drug, while the no treatment group gets zilch, gets nothing. And you compare the outcomes. However, there is a serious problem in using a no treatment control group, a problem that many of you probably heard of. And this problem has to do with something called the placebo effect. So there's this fascinating property of the human mind where if you believe that you are receiving a treatment, if you are expecting a treatment to be effective, some people will actually begin feeling better. These are called psychosomatic effects, when the mind affects the body. Now, the placebo effect probably is not going to cure terminal cancer, but something like depression or anxiety, which has a lot more to do with one's state of mind, can certainly be influenced by the placebo effect. And of course, this creates a confound. So if you give your drug and the people in your drug condition, in the experimental group, start doing better, is that from the drug or from the placebo? So to deal with this problem, many studies will employ what is called a placebo control group. So in the case of drug studies, a placebo will entail giving people something that looks a lot like the drug. So if the drug is in the form of a pill, the placebo group also gets a pill that they swallow. However, that pill is inactive. It does not contain the actual drug. And of course, the people in the placebo group won't know that they're in the placebo group. And this is called blinding. Now, sometimes you will have a treatment condition where people get the drug, a placebo control group where people get a placebo, and also a no treatment control group. And this setup is useful if you want to measure the magnitude of the placebo effect, and you would do so by comparing the placebo control group with the no treatment control group. So another addendum to this conversation is that the importance of a placebo effect will, to some extent, depend on the type of research that you are conducting. And here we can make a distinction between two types of research, what is called outcome research and process research. So if you're conducting outcome research, what you're interested in is the effectiveness of a treatment. Does it work or does it not work? How well does it work? And in this case, you don't care that much about why it works or the underlying mechanisms that make it work. You just want to know, does it work or not, and to what extent. Now, conversely, if you're engaged in process research, what you're doing is trying to identify the active components of the treatment. You want to understand why the treatment works. You want to understand the mechanisms that make it work. And in this case, the placebo effect really has to be separated out from other active components of the treatment. All right, so let's talk about something called manipulation checks. So we discussed the process of manipulation as one of the ingredients of a true experiment. And of course, in a true experiment, the researcher needs to manipulate some variable. And the variable that gets manipulated is called the independent variable. So let's imagine you have the following experiment. Let's say you want to test the effects of feedback on motivation. So let's say you have two levels of the independent variable. People are given encouraging feedback, like, oh, great job, that was wonderful. Or discouraging feedback, like, oh, that was pathetic. Or maybe something less mean, you did very poorly. Okay, so encouraging and discouraging feedback. And afterwards, there's a questionnaire to assess motivation levels to see if the type of feedback can affect levels of motivation. So you're manipulating your independent variable as you're supposed to. You are doing everything by the books. But you may wonder, is your manipulation salient enough? Is it being noticed by your participants? Is it affecting them at all? So you can perform what is called a manipulation check, in which maybe you give people an additional questionnaire after the study with questions like, how would you describe the feedback that you received? Or a question like, to what extent did the feedback make you feel encouraged or discouraged on a scale of 1 to 7, let's say? And so this procedure is designed to give you some additional insights as to whether or not your manipulation was registered or was even noticed by your participants. So then let's say that you run your study and you don't find any effect of feedback on motivation, and you examine the manipulation check questionnaire and learn that most people in your study didn't really notice the feedback or weren't affected by the feedback. Well, maybe in that case, you should figure out how to make your manipulation more effective and then rerun the study. So there are two ways of conducting a manipulation check. One is to measure the independent variable explicitly or directly. So if you're trying to manipulate someone's mood, let's say, using images or music, maybe you include a mood measure, something that actually measures a person's mood. Or you can include a questionnaire that contains certain questions about the manipulation. For example, was it even noticed? So manipulation checks are going to be especially important in the following 4 situations. One is participant manipulations, and this is when you are manipulating your participants. So let's say you are trying to induce frustration. You want to make your participants frustrated. And one way of doing that is having them complete some very difficult or unpleasant or impossible task. And the idea is they're going to fail and they will feel frustrated as a result. Well, you may want to include a manipulation check to ensure that your task actually made people feel frustrated as opposed to simply assuming that it did. Next, it involves studies that have subtle manipulations. So some studies will have very subtle manipulations of the independent variable. And if that's the case, you may want to include a manipulation check to see whether or not people in the study were even aware of these manipulations happening. Next, you have placebo controls. So for placebos to be effective, in part requires that they be believable. And sometimes people can figure out if they are in a placebo group or the experimental group. So you may want to include a manipulation check to see whether or not people knew which group they were assigned to. And finally, number 4 is simulations. And we'll talk more about simulations in the next section. But a simulation is when you try to create an environment that mimics the real world. And the idea is for that environment to be more immersive and feel more realistic. Now, in this case, again, you may want to include a manipulation check to see how immersed were people really in this contrived environment that you've created.